During your presentation today, you said moral injury, it's been around probably since the beginning of time, but only defined as recently as 2009. How would you define and explain what moral injury is?
Moral injury is something that happens to us when we choose to perpetrate an act that we know is wrong, that's in conflict with our moral core, or we observe something that we know is wrong and do nothing, or we have something done to us that's traumatic in some way. These things can cause a deep guilt and shame that can make a person feel as if they've lost their innocence, or if they, in some extreme cases, they may feel that they no longer have, they're no longer who they were before, and they no longer have a reason to live or be.
Because they've done something that went so against their moral compass.
Right.
So recently defined, but this must be something that is so common because we're focusing on the theatre of war here this weekend in Lourdes and people from all over the world who've served in militaries. And this is something you'd imagine they face day in and day out, having to make moral decisions that they would maybe later regret.
Well, I think every human being has, a tough time with making decisions, choices each day, right or wrong. But in a theater of war, you're presented with a lot more opportunity to make a mistake or choose the wrong thing, or
I suppose the consequences, though, are much dire.
In a theater of war.
Yeah.
Right, so consequently enhanced chance to have a moral injury because people around you are dying, you're making decisions, you're being directed to do things that may be against your moral compass. There's a lot more opportunity for moral injury, but it's not something that we commonly see. Moral injury might not appear or present in a clinical sense for years after war, or years after the incident that occurred, or the thing that you did, or the thing that you didn't do happened. And so you may not even be aware of it. It's so subconscious. And we probably have a lot of people out there that have moral injury and don't even know it. And part of the reason for that would be is that moral injury is very much connected to deep shame, deep guilt, deep grief over the loss of your innocence and the loss of who you were before.
So it's not something that people are innately willing to talk about.
Exactly. That's kind of the whole thing about moral injury. You have deep, deep suffering, but you're so ashamed of what happened that you don't want anyone to know that you're that person. And you see yourself as no longer a good person. It's complicated, and it brings incredible suffering.
Like I said, here in Lourdes this weekend, we have service people from all over the world, from military serving in different countries, and many, many of them have been in combat and would have faced these dilemmas when they are given the command by the superior to do something.
Right.
It's something that they would inherently be against. But isn't that what you sign up for? It's, when you're in the military, I mean, that's how it works. You follow the command. If everyone kind of said, well, I'm going to make my own judgment on this and follow my moral instinct, you'd have kind of mayhem within the ranks.
We sign up for that, but in some cases, there are people, soldiers, airmen, Marines, sailors, who maybe didn't fully realize what they were signing up for, or that another war would occur that would be prolonged and would require them to go on multiple deployments, not just like one trip to Korea for a year and back. I mean, we've been moving all over the map for decades now.
And it could be at a stage when they're in so deep, the realization sets in, this isn't what I signed up for.
Right. Plus, when you're at war, you lose kind of sense of time and space, and you're disconnected from, oftentimes you can't even communicate with your family. So, and you're working under incredibly stressful conditions, and you're exhausted. The fact that you could be killed at any time, or you could be asked to do things that...
So the line between right and wrong maybe becomes a bit more blurred in that scenario, and then maybe it's in later years when you're reflecting on it, that when the moral injury sets in, would that be common?
I think that also it becomes a matter of the your lens, the prism that you're looking at the situation through. It's maybe, you may not be as clear-headed as you normally would be back at home with your family, but I think that can compound things. I think it can kind of make you a little more vulnerable to a moral injury, or to making a choice that you normally wouldn't make, because you really aren't in normal circumstances. You really aren't who you were before. So it's complex. And we now have technology that keeps us alive. So in previous wars, a lot more people would have died because they didn't have a Kevlar vest. They didn't have a vehicle that was up-armored to protect them as we did in these last few engagements. So people were being kept alive that would never have made it, and that's a good thing on one hand. On the other hand, the injuries, the physical injuries, are much more severe. The lethality of our weaponry is much more intense.
Is it something that's talked about within the military, moral injuries? Because I presume if it was something that was highlighted and something that troops were told to be aware of, again, it goes back to that thing, during combat, it may cause mayhem when the commander-in-chief gives the order. If you had each soldier trying to weigh up in their mind, well, where do I stand on this morally? Can I pull the trigger? Can I not? Is this a just killing?
Well, any war that the United States enters into has been thoroughly vetted, and it's going to be following the rules of engagement, the rule of law, the just war theory of checking all the boxes to make sure that legally we can engage in a war. But moral injury as a condition or a result of war is a relatively new phenomenon. This is not something, just the term moral injury, part of the reason that we're providing moral injury awareness sessions here at Lourdes on this pilgrimage and 2 previous pilgrimages is to raise awareness so that not only can we help those that are suffering greatly, but we can also be aware to the point that we can recognize and reach out to help those that are suffering. But the average soldier or sailor, airman, or marine, I would imagine they're not aware of moral injury because the training or the awareness...
It's just not there.
It's just not there. Yeah.
It's such a difficult and complex issue, as you alluded to a while ago, because different people have different morals, don't they? And they take their moral guidance from different places.
Right.
But if we focus on, because we're here in Lourdes at this pilgrimage, Catholics and Christians, so your ultimate moral guidance is Jesus Christ, the 10 Commandments. How did they reconcile even going to war in the first place when one of the commandments is thou shalt not kill, and you're putting yourself into a scenario where the likelihood that you might have to kill someone is pretty high?
Because we have a volunteer army now, and all the services are volunteer, we no longer have a draft. It's a choice that you make. Some of it is driven by tradition. There are a lot of families that have always been military, and they want to carry on the tradition. It's a choice, which is different from previous wars, like Vietnam War and previous to that. Those were all major drafts. That there was no choice. Every cross-section of America was sent to war. Now it's all volunteer, so you're signing up. But I don't know how anyone could possibly know what lies ahead, what's going to happen when I go to Afghanistan. And I think a lot of people feel that what we're doing by going into the military is a noble thing. We're actually contributing to the maintenance of peace. But when
maybe is that how they level it in their head, that like someone actually asked you a question today, and they mentioned maybe a just killing or a righteous killing, but it's something that would help push peace ultimately in the end if this war is won by the United States.
Right.
So is that maybe how they morally can level it in their mind? This is, in the end, ultimately this will lead to peace.
That may be for a certain layer or percentage of military personnel, but I don't think it really goes that deep for most people that sign up. Certainly as a Catholic, when I looked at the possibility. No one in my family was ever in the military. My father was shocked that I was signing up to work in intelligence but be affiliated with the military in any way. And it wasn't because of his theology. It was just because he didn't want to see me be in any dangerous situation. But again, I think that it would be difficult for anyone to predict what would be happening at war or how long we would be at war. I don't think anyone ever imagined that when we went into Iraq or Afghanistan that we would be there for as many years as we had been. But things happen at war. Even in my own experience of being at war, I was a principal advisor to the U.S. ambassador for hostage affairs. That was an unbelievable, for me, moral conundrum. And I myself realized through the course of my graduate work that I had suffered moral injury. And I realized by working with my spiritual director that probably the reason why I chose to pursue graduate studies in theology, I thought it was to deepen my faith and deepen my spirituality, but actually it was because I wanted to find out why I was suffering. You know, why am I now questioning my own faith, or whether or not I made the right choice to be in a position where I was in a theater of war, where horrible things were happening to people. I mean, unspeakable, unimaginable things that I worked with every day. You
can imagine the people in the world now, the Russian soldiers who in years to come will have to reconcile with what's happening in Ukraine at the moment.
You know, I really wonder about that, because it's one thing to make a joke about godless commies, you know, because that's how we used to look at the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union. They weren't necessarily raised, I mean, there were some Orthodox Russians that kind of maintained their faith, but by and large, Russia was a state that, you know, didn't believe in God. I mean, it was a different construct to be raised in, I think. So what I might find morally wrong might be something that a Russian soldier or an Iraqi terrorist doesn't have any problem doing.
And is that because you
mentioned
this? And
they sleep well at night.
You mentioned this in your talk today as well, that maybe for them the moral authority is the state.
Right. That's basically what we would be talking about.
Is the leader.
Right.
Not God or commandments of the Quran or Allah.
Right. And you make me think about ISIS as an example. Does ISIS really, or did they really represent Muhammad, what he said in the Quran, in the tenets of Islam? Most Muslims would tell you, no, that's just an extreme, you know, factional group that
are taking their moral authority from somewhere else.
Right.
Let me ask you, Dorothy, because I know we're short on time, healing from moral injuries. One of the big things you talked about today was forgiveness, to forgive yourself first.
Yeah.
How do people forgive themselves when they come back from, again, as we say, the theater of war, when they've had to do things, heinous things? It must be incredibly difficult for a lot of them.
When you're not able to recognize, you're not even aware that you have moral injury, that what had happened to you at war affected you so deeply. And you may not even recognize the symptoms that look very much like post-traumatic stress disorder, but are more moral injury, because moral injury is guilt and shame-based. Post-traumatic stress disorder is fear-based. It's often misdiagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder because that is in the diagnosis manual. So when you don't recognize that there's anything wrong with you, but you know, family members, loved ones, superior officers, commanders, unit members, they may recognize a change in you, but you're so deeply ashamed or in grief over what happened that you don't even realize that you're drinking too much, you're behaving in a violent way, you're no longer yourself. You might not even recognize it. And forgiveness is what is required in order to begin healing. You have to be able to forgive yourself. But if you can't even recognize that there's something wrong, I mean, if you're so deep into your grief or your guilt or your shame, it requires community to help you to come back. And clergy is uniquely placed and qualified to be the catalyst to change. And the first step in that change is acknowledging what happened. When you did something that was so horrible and you now believe that you're no longer a good person and that you have, so damaged your moral compass or your soul that you're not worthy of being part of a community, the family, the church, you begin to isolate and separate yourself, and it just devolves down to a very low place.
We're speaking of the extreme cases, of course, of people who have had to make incredibly difficult and terrible decisions during war, but even the simpler ones. You mentioned an amazing story today of a young guy walking through an area of Iraq known as the Garden of Eden,
right?
Because of its beauty and its history. And you said he realized, why am I walking through the Garden of Eden holding this machine gun?
Right, that was his moment of realizing that
morally, he was
had
not okay with
a conflict in his moral compass, in his soul, with what was happening at war. He signed up to be an infantry soldier, out on the ground, close to combat. And in that instance that you mentioned, the work that they were doing was at the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates River, which in the Bible says it's thought, and it's thought historically, is the Garden of Eden. And he realized after time at war that
I should not be walking through the Garden
what
of
am
Eden
I doing
with a
walking through
machine
the
gun.
Garden of Eden? If this is where it all started, why am I carrying an M16? I mean, what am I doing? What are we still doing here?
Dorothy Perkins, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.